IT 9510T, the prosecutor versus Goran Jelisić. Very well, thank you. Can the prosecution, please, can we have the appearances, please?
I appear for the prosecution, but the Chamber will notice that Madame Del Ponte, the prosecutor herself, is also here today.
Je vous salue d'abord.
Good morning, Mr. Nice, and special greetings to Madame Del Ponte, the prosecutor, which I see for the first time in her prosecutor robes, and on behalf of all my colleagues, I bid her good morning. Can we have the appearances for the defense, please? Your Honors, my name is Veselin Londrovic, a lawyer from Bielina, and my learned colleague, Mr. Michael Greaves, is unable to attend this morning due to other official business. Thank you. Very well. I wish also to say good morning to the numerous guests in the public gallery. As you know, we are here to conclude, at least in this trial chamber, the trial of Goran Jelisić. You know that the judgment that is going to be read out will be available in both languages, I think, Mr. Formi, and will be distributed. And as has become traditional in this tribunal, the President will provide a summary. My colleagues, Judge Riyad on my right and Judge Rodriguez on my left, have rendered their judgment unanimously. I'm going to read that summary relatively slowly so that the interpreters can carry out their task properly. As you know, on the 19th of October this year, the trial chamber acquitted Goran Jelisić of the crime of genocide, but found him guilty of violations of the laws or customs of war and of crimes against humanity. Today, the trial chamber will render its reasoned judgment and pass the sentence upon Goran Jelisić, which it has determined in respect of the 31 counts retained against him for murdering 13 persons, inflicting bodily harm upon 4 persons, and stealing from various detainees. Before pronouncing the sentence, the trial chamber wishes to restate briefly the elements of this case, which will be set out in more detail in its written judgment. The prosecutor instigated proceedings against Goran Jelisić for the crimes which, for the most part, he allegedly committed in early May 1992 in the municipality of Brčko. Brčko is a sizable town with a population of approximately 41,000, of whom 55% were Muslim, situated in the northeast of Bosnia-Herzegovina on the border with the Republic of Croatia. On the 30th of April 1992, 2 explosions destroyed the bridges in Brčko spanning the Sava River. These explosions, which occurred after the local Serb representatives had demanded that the town be split into 3 sectors, including one which was to be exclusively Serb, may be considered as marking the commencement of hostilities by the Serbian forces. On the 1st of May, radio broadcasts ordered the Muslim and Croat inhabitants to surrender their arms. Serb forces comprised of soldiers and paramilitary and police forces were deployed within the town. Serbian troops, paramilitary and police troops, which, according to testimony heard from the trial chamber, were not from Brčko, crisscrossed the town. The Serbian offensive targeted the non-Serb population of Brčko. Neighborhood by neighborhood, the inhabitants were directed to collection centers where the Serbs were separated from the Muslims and the Croats. The Muslim, Croatian, women, children and men over 60 were first evacuated from Brčko. The Muslim and Croatian men between 16 and 60 were held in collection centers. Some Muslims were led off to the Brčko police station. Finally, on about the 7th of May, nearly all the Muslims and some Croats too were transferred by bus or lorry to the Luka camp. Several women were also taken to the camp. Luka camp was a former port facility consisting of a series of warehouses located on one side of a narrow road cutting through the camp and administrative buildings on the other side of the road. The detainees were incarcerated in the first two warehouses, whilst interrogations were conducted in the first office in the administrative building. According to testimony heard by the trial chamber, hundreds of persons were detained at Luka camp in May 1992 in inhumane and degrading living conditions. Although far from all the detainees suffered the fate Goran Jelisić was to reserve for some of them. Many were released, and some given laissez-passer once Serbian soldiers had vouched for their behavior. Those who remained in detention at Luka camp and survived, and also some of those who were rearrested after having been released, would subsequently be interned at the Batković detention camp in July 1992. And then most of them were exchanged beginning in October of that year. It was at the Brčko police headquarters and the Luka camp that Goran Jelisić committed his crimes in the month of May 1992. The trial chamber has little information on the life of Goran Jelisić. He was born on the 7th of June 1968 in Bijeljina. He arrived in Brčko around the 1st of May 1992. Prior to the events, he had never been convicted for violent acts, and it appears that he worked as a farm mechanic. At the time of the events, he was wearing clothes which allowed him to pass as a policeman. However, the trial chamber has not heard any further information indicating that he may have belonged to a police, military, or paramilitary structure. At Luka camp, it appears that people obeyed him, but here again information is lacking. Others could also clearly come and go in the camp as they pleased and attack the detainees. For the murder of numerous detainees, and for cruelly mistreating detainees at Luka camp, and for stealing from certain detainees, Goran Jelisić was charged by the prosecutor with genocide, violations of the laws or customs of war, and crimes against humanity. He was arrested on the 22nd of January 1998, subsequent to a warrant of arrest issued by the tribunal. He was immediately transferred to the tribunal's detention unit here in The Hague. After several procedural matters had been settled, which are referred to in the judgment, Goran Jelisić pleaded guilty to the charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but not guilty to the charge of genocide. In view of the elements presented when Goran Jelisić pleaded guilty to war crimes and crimes against humanity, And in view of the testimony submitted by the witnesses of the prosecution and of the defense on the character of the accused, how are the crimes committed by Goran Jelisić to be evaluated, and what sentence is called for? The trial chamber wishes to state clearly that the circumstances under which the acts ascribed to the accused were committed make the crimes appear especially abject and revolting. Goran Jelisić acted violently towards the detainees. For no apparent reason, he punched them, kicked them, and beat them with truncheons, clubs, and other instruments, without consideration for the person's sex or vulnerability. Above all, Goran Jelisić is guilty of murdering 13 people whom he executed in cold blood. 5 of these murders were perpetrated near the Brčko police station, and always in an identical manner. After being interrogated, the victims were led by Goran Jelisić into an alley near the station, and then he proceeded to execute them, generally with 2 bullets to the back of the neck, fired from a scorpion pistol fitted with a silencer. The other 8 murders ascribed to him were committed in Luka camp. Here again, the murders were perpetrated in the same way. The victims were first subjected to interrogations, conducted or participated in by Goran Jelisić, and then beaten with truncheons and clubs. Next, armed with a scorpion pistol, Goran Jelisić made them go outside and led them to the corner of the buildings, where the victims were then executed point blank with 1 or 2 bullets to the back of the neck or the back. Some of them were forced to kneel on a grate and then killed with 1 or 2 bullets to the back of the head. 1 Croatian detainee had his ear cut off before being shot. The bodies were then taken behind by the detainees, of course those who survived, thrown into the river or crammed into refrigerated lorries before being put into mass graves. Witnesses declared that Goran Jelisić took pleasure from his position, one which gave him a feeling of power, of holding power over life or death over the detainees, and of acting as he pleased, and that he even took a certain pride in the number of victims that he had executed. Thus, Goran Jelisić allegedly proclaimed to the Luka camp detainees that before being able to have his coffee every morning, he needed to execute 20 to 30 persons. He also allegedly said to a detainee after one execution on the 15th of May that it had been his 83rd case. Whatever the exact number of his victims, the crimes of Goran Jelisić formed part of the armed operation carried out by the Serb forces against the Muslim population of Brčko. This offensive displays a certain degree of organization. The rounding up of the population at different points in the town, their subsequent transfer to detention centers, the interrogations, the violence, and the murders, always perpetrated in an identical manner over a brief period of time, demonstrate the widespread or systematic nature of the attack against the civilian population of Brčko. The trial chamber considered that the guilty plea of Goran Jelisić in respect of war crimes and crimes against humanity was entered under conditions allowing this plea to be accepted, and Goran Jelisić found guilty of the crimes. Notwithstanding this, the prosecutor also included the crime of genocide in the indictment. For the crime of genocide to be proved, the trial chamber must be convinced beyond all reasonable doubt either that an act of genocide was perpetrated in which Goran Jelisić may have been an agent, or that he himself committed such an act.
Admittedly, through his behavior and the statements which witnesses claim he made, in particular those expressing a profound contempt for the Muslim population, Goran Jelisić presents the external signs of a perpetrator of genocide within the widely accepted meaning of the term. The first time he stood before this very trial chamber, Goran Jelisić introduced himself using the name Adolf. He allegedly presented himself to the Luka camp detainees as the Serbian Adolf, and allegedly claimed to have gone to Birchko to kill Muslims. He made scornful and discriminatory remarks. He humiliated his victims and regularly insulted them by calling them balias, a particularly degrading insult for members of the Muslim community. But how is this conduct to be interpreted legally? Is it discriminatory conduct, as in the case of persecution, for instance? Or are the words and deeds of Goran Jelisić to be interpreted as a consistent desire to destroy a group as such, or at least in part? Was he acting on orders, or on his own initiative? In fact, his attitude essentially reveals behavior which, in addition to being unquestionably odious and discriminatory, was opportunistic and inconsistent. Although lists of names of persons appear to have been compiled, the trial chamber knows neither by whom nor to what end. No element submitted during the trial allowed the chain of command within which Goran Jelisić operated to be identified or proved whether he was obeying orders in committing his crimes. It appears from the elements presented to the trial chamber that the prosecutor has not proved beyond all reasonable doubt that all-inclusive genocide was committed in Birchko or elsewhere in May 1992. Even in the hypothetical case considered by the trial chamber, in which the issue of whether an act of genocide can be perpetrated within a geographical area limited to a region or a municipality is raised. The trial chamber intends to dispel any ambiguity in this respect. The trial chamber is not stating that there was no genocide in Birchko in May 1992, but merely noting that the elements presented do not allow it to conclude that such an all-inclusive genocide was committed. Furthermore, it has not been established that to carry out the executions, Goran Jelisić relied on the aforesaid lists. The witnesses called by the prosecutor stated that Goran Jelisić, if not exclusively so, also killed randomly. Moreover, on his own initiative, and sometimes against all logic, he issued laissez-passer to certain detainees, most notably to a well-known figure in the Muslim community. Finally, in addition to pointing to his opportunistic nature, psychiatric experts have portrayed Goran Jelisić as having a disturbed personality, presenting borderline, antisocial, narcissistic characteristics marked in particular by a certain immaturity and a hunger for recognition. In this instance, the trial chamber is of the opinion that the acts of Goran Jelisić are not the expression of a person with a conscious intention to destroy a group as such. The trial chamber recalls that discriminatory intent does not equate to genocidal intent, a peculiar intent which renders genocide special and distinguishes it from the other crimes of international humanitarian law, and in particularly the crime of persecution, which is also covered by our statute. The prosecution has therefore also failed to establish that Goran Jelisić committed these acts with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Consequently, the trial chamber could only find Goran Jelisić not guilty of the crime of genocide. And now, we will deal with the part of which deals with the plea of guilty and the sentence which the judges have set. And for this part, I will turn to Goran Jelisić and ask him to rise to hear the trial chamber's verdict. Mr. Goran Jelisić, you have heard the reasons for which the trial chamber acquits you of count 1, genocide, but finds you guilty on 31 counts for violations of the laws or customs of war, counts 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 30, 32, 36, 38, 40, and 44. And declares you guilty as well for crimes against humanity, counts 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, 21, 23, 31, 33, 37, 39, and 41. On this basis, in determining its sentence merited by all your crimes, the trial chamber has taken into account all the elements provided by the prosecution and your defense counsel, and all the elements of the case. The trial chamber has, inter alia, taken into consideration as mitigating circumstances your age at the moment of the crime. You were 23 years old. The fact that you were never convicted for a violent crime, and that you are the father of a small child. And lastly, but to a much lesser extent, explained in the decision your guilty plea. However, Goran Jelisić, the trial chamber must emphasize the repugnant, bestial, and sadistic nature of your behavior. The trial chamber considers that your scornful attitude towards your victims, your enthusiasm, if not to say your pleasure, in committing the crimes, the inhumanity of the crimes, and your dangerous nature, evidenced by your actions, in the case in point, constitute especially aggravating circumstances which far outweigh the mitigating circumstances. The crimes for which you, Goran Jelisić, have committed shock the conscience of mankind. The trial chamber is convinced that those persons who survived and their close relatives carry with them the immeasurable suffering and for an indeterminate time the memory of those sinister events. But beyond your case, and I turn to the public gallery, I would also say, we would like to say, that although one of the missions of the International Criminal Tribunal is to contribute to the restoration of peace in the former Yugoslavia, but to do so, the identification, prosecution, and punishment of the principal political and military officials responsible for the atrocities committed since 1991 in the territories concerned must be a priority. However, where it need be, it should be recalled that although the crimes perpetrated during armed conflicts may be more specifically ascribed to one or other of these officials, these high-ranking officials, they could not achieve their ends without the enthusiastic help or contribution, direct or indirect, of individuals such as you, Goran Jelisić. The trial chamber convicts you, Goran Jelisić, because you are guilty of stealing money from persons detained at Luka camp. In particular, Hasib Begić, Zečir Osmić, Enis Zukic, and Armin Grapić. It convicts you because you are guilty of causing bodily harm to the Osmić brothers, Zečir and Rešad. Guilty of causing bodily harm to Muhammad Bukvić, guilty of causing bodily harm to Amir Didic. It convicts you because it considers, and that you are, guilty of murdering an unidentified male. We will never know. He himself did not know. It was a man. Guilty of murdering Hassan Yasharovich. Guilty of murdering a young man from Shintirai. Guilty of murdering Ahmed Hodzic, or Hadjic, alias Papa. Guilty of murdering a person with the first name Swad. Guilty of murdering Yasminko Chumurovich, alias Yashche. Guilty of murdering the brothers Huso and Smail Zahirovich. Guilty of murdering Nazarukvich. Guilty of murdering Muharrem Ahmetovich. Guilty of murdering Stipo Glavochevich. Guilty of murdering Novalia. And lastly, guilty of murdering Adnan Kutsalovich. Consequently, for all these crimes, for all your crimes, the trial chamber sentences you, Goran Jelisić, to 40 years in prison. Court stands adjourned.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.